Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee, analysing the events of the past 7 days with context and clarity alongside 4 distinguished international correspondents. In a week that's seen the dramatic dawn arrest of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, already disgraced and detitled of his ties to Jeffrey Epstein, who was taken into custody on Thursday, his 66th birthday, alleged to have committed misconduct in public office, sharing, while trade envoy, confidential government material with a billionaire paedophile. The latest ramifications of the Epstein files causing a crisis for the monarch, visible and audible on a walkabout.
What's your reaction to your brother's arrest, sir? Sir, what's your reaction to your brother's arrest? Any reaction to your brother's arrest, sir?
It's been a week there. Tributes have been paid to Jesse Jackson, who died aged 84, a giant of US civil rights movement who marched with Martin Luther King and worked to continue the movement after his assassination. Former President Obama said Jesse Jackson laid the groundwork for his own political rise.
I was born in the slum, but the slum was not born in me. And it wasn't born in you, and you can make it. Wherever you are tonight, you can make it.
And it's been a week of technological might on show in China at the Spring Festival Gala amid the seeing in of the Lunar New Year. The centrepiece, this sword-carrying troupe of back-flipping robots, the choreography on display described as kung fu meets drunken boxing, underlies Beijing's domination of the fledgling but rapidly expanding business of humanoids. Meanwhile, world leaders headed for Delhi for one of the biggest global gatherings on artificial intelligence, focusing on governance and safety while competing for investment and infrastructure. A difficult balancing act, best characterised perhaps by the dynamic between these two, the bosses of industry rivals OpenAI's Sam Altman and Anthropic's Dario Armando, who couldn't bring themselves quite to hold hands when asked to on stage. Meanwhile, Meta boss Mark Zuckerberg appeared at an LA court testifying in a landmark civil trial to answer accusations that its platforms Instagram and Facebook, as well as Google's YouTube, are engineered to keep children addicted. He claimed users spent so much time there because of, quote, its value, which takes us back to the Delhi AI Summit and President Macron making headlines on arrival with his own critique of social media.
Some of them claim to be in favor of free speech. Okay, we are in favor of free algorithm. Totally transparent. Because, free speech is a pure bullshit if nobody knows how you are guided through this so-called free speech.
And it's also been a week where the US Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's landmark tariffs policy, and he's about to speak. Let's have a listen to President Trump live reacting at the White House.
Votes, we won in a landslide. With all the cheating that went on, there was a lot of it, but we still won in a landslide. Too big to rig. But these people are obnoxious, ignorant, and loud. They're very loud. And I think certain justices are afraid of that. They don't want to do the right thing. They're afraid of it. This was an important case to me, more as a symbol of economic national security. And also, I would say, just for our country itself, so important, because we're doing so well as a country. We've never done so well. The good news is that there are methods, practices, statutes, and authorities, as recognized by the entire court in this terrible decision, and also as recognized by Congress, which they refer to, that are even stronger than the IEEPA tariffs available to me as President of the United States. And in actuality, I was very modest in my ask of other countries and businesses because I wanted to do, and it's very important, I wanted to be very well behaved because I wanted to do anything, I didn't want to do anything that would affect the decision of the court, because I understand the court. I understand how they are very easily swayed. I want to be a good boy.
For those watching us live on France 24, we've just watched President Trump for the past 10 minutes talking about his response to that decision to end his landmark tariffs policy struck out by the Supreme Court, saying this: I'm going to go for even stronger methods available to me, saying that there will be other methods that he's now looking at. If you're watching the online version on YouTube or on podcast later on, this will be shrunk down to about a minute, giving you the essence of what he's just said. So let's meet the panel tonight. Let's go to London first of all. Victor Mallet, senior editor for the Financial Times. Great to have you with us tonight, Victor. First of all, just listening to the news coming in tonight, the tariffs being struck down. What's your sense of the implications? I guess lots of questions on what it now means for all of those countries that are thinking, how does that work for us? Do we get money back after the deals that some countries might think they were forced or at least given an ultimatum on?
Well, I'm amazed that you think you can compress a rambling 10 minutes into a minute online, because it's very difficult to draw any clear conclusions from what Trump was saying. I mean, he didn't mention the reason for the court's decision, which was his misuse of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. He seems to be sort of, essentially what he seems to be saying is that he can impose the tariffs again anyway. And I think he's shown once again that there's no plan behind all this. There's no logic behind all this, and that he might, as before, be motivated more by spite or sentiment than anything else. So he actually said, I can destroy the trade, I can destroy the country that I'm targeting. I can do anything I want, but I'm not allowed to impose $1 of tariffs by the court. He doesn't explain at any point why he's doing all this or what the purpose is, or he doesn't really address the fundamentals of the court's decision. He just talks about the dissenting judgment of Kavanaugh, saying that I have other ways to do this. So I mean, I suppose the brief conclusion we can draw is that he's planning to reimpose or to carry on imposing tariffs, possibly even more severely than before, as a way of taking sort of revenge, if you like, on the people who've countered him. And that's where we stand at the moment. I suppose then the question is whether Congress will eventually or finally assert itself, which it's completely failed to do until now.
It is very interesting, deliberately vague, perhaps a take on the old royal mantra, always complain, never explain. And of course, that mantra will change tonight. Given the events of the past 7 days, Victor, I should also say, author of several acclaimed books, pertinent to what we've been talking about as well tonight. Your latest is the newly released Far-Right France, Le Pen, Bardella and the Future of Europe. Victor, they say never judge a book by its cover. This is a brilliant cover. Tell us how the book tour is going in the UK right now.
It is a brilliant cover. Book tours are book tours. It's been going great. I'm getting quite a lot of attention in the British media and some reviews and so on. And I'm hoping to do also events in France, not just in Britain, although the book is not out in French yet.
Do you know whether Mr. Bardella has read it?
I don't actually. I did talk to a member of his staff and tell him that it was available, but I don't yet know whether he's read it. He does feature quite prominently in the book, as you can imagine.
It's brilliant to have you with us tonight, Victor, and for your rapid summary of what we think's just happened in the past 10 minutes of those President Trump's take on the landmark decision by the Supreme Court. Let's move to our other panel tonight. In the studio, we have Janine de Giovanni, seasoned war correspondent, multiple award-winning author of 9 books, including The Morning They Came for Us, Dispatches from Syria. Janine is CEO of the Reckoning Project as well, training journalists on how to document war crimes in Ukraine and the Middle East. It is great, as always, to see you, Janine. You're just back from the Munich Security Conference. We're going to get into that later, discussing Ukraine this week. But I want to ask you about the Board of Peace meeting, the inaugural President Trump meeting. Huge challenge ahead, the Leviathan task of picking up Gaza from root to fruit. What's your assessment of the week?
So the Board of Peace met yesterday in Washington, D.C. It made me think the cast of it, aside from Sigrid Kaag, who is a former UN official who is in charge of basically the Syrian chemical weapons program, very competent United Nations official. It's basically, as Hillary Clinton once said, a basket of deplorables. We've got the president of Kazakhstan, we've got the president of Argentina, we've got Vladimir Putin, who of course will not be there in person, and basically a group of people that know nothing about the Middle East or about Gaza. So it's mainly focused on the reconstruction, which will cost something like $70 billion. as well as the stabilization force. And that is another interesting concept. It's going to be led by Indonesia, but it will have troops or soldiers from Morocco, from Kosovo. Turkey has been ruled out. The Israelis refuse to let the Turks lead that. So I think that also the disarmament of Hamas is another concern, and Israel has put that very high on the agenda. That is what they want. I know Gaza very well. I've worked there since 1990. I know the lay of the land. It's going to be really hard to rebuild what the Israelis have destroyed in the past 3 years, because basically there is no infrastructure. They've destroyed the healthcare system, the hospitals, the schools, the libraries, the universities. Even now, the housing is an absolute emergency. The UN just issued a statement today saying that the Israelis still will not let emergency housing into the Gaza Strip so that people can at least have a roof over their heads, or a temporary roof.
Let's stay within the Middle East.
Right.
And a subject we're going to go to very shortly, the Epstein files. You're
Which
in them.
I'm in it.
What's this is
Shockingly.
via Syria.
Yes.
Talk us through this.
I'm in it not for the predatory sex trafficking. I'm in it because in 2012, our colleague Marie Colvin was killed in Homs in Syria. And I was part of a group of people. I was working in Syria at the time, trying to get her remains out of Homs. Now, I used to see Terje Rod Larsen at that time, who, of course, we know a lot more about now, who was
This
one
is
of
the former Deputy Prime Minister of Norway, a diplomat, involved in the Oslo Accords, and is implicated in the Epstein files, is in being investigated for gross corruption, which he denies.
And along with his wife, who was the Norwegian ambassador to Jordan most recently. They were a golden couple. Their play Oslo was on Broadway, became a Netflix series about these two brokering peace in the Middle East. I was in the files basically because Terje Rod Larsen forwarded my request to help getting Marie's body out of Homs to Jeffrey Epstein. So, and it's the strangest, he forwarded it on the email, the g@vacation.com. Why on earth Jeffrey Epstein could have been involved in this high-level diplomacy of trying to broker between warring factions in Syria, getting out the body of a British-American journalist, I have no idea, aside that it will go back to whether or not Epstein was Mossad or he was a friend of the Assads. So what I think is really interesting about all this is Oslo. The Oslo Peace Accords, I was working on the ground in Israel-Palestine at the time, 1993, was disastrous for Palestinians in every way, catastrophic. Larsen was always regarded as very pro-Israel, not a friend of the Palestinians. At the time, we couldn't really figure out how this deal, which then President Clinton, also involved in the Epstein world, brokered the big handshake on the White House lawn between the Israelis and Arafat. So all of this coming out now, 30 years after Oslo, is absolutely extraordinary. And also Larsen, Epstein, the world of diplomacy, power, money, greed, sex, all rolled into one.
Which takes us, Janina, it's great that you're with us tonight. It naturally takes us to Washington, D.C., because we can bring in Murtaza Hussain to talk about this a little more. Murtaza is National Security and Foreign Affairs reporter for Dropside News, a platform based in D.C. He writes the Substack too, Murtaza Hussain newsletter. Welcome to the programme tonight. Great that you're with us. You've been looking at Epstein's links to Israel, including this week investigating the installation of his camera and surveillance system in New York. I think you've said before that your work to Epstein's links to Israeli intelligence, you don't think he was a spy for Israel Mossad in a conventional sense. He was over and above that.
Sure, that's right. So this week, Dropside published, as you mentioned, a report based on the Department of Justice disclosures from Epstein's communications. And we've been pouring through these millions of pages, and we've done a few stories already, but this latest story is about one particular incident, which relates to the very intimate, close relationship that Epstein enjoyed with former Israeli Prime Minister and former Defense Minister Ehud Barak. So Barak was known to be a close friend of Epstein. He stayed at his homes and apartments in New York. But one thing that was not noted before, and is contained in these disclosures, is that there was a level of a collaboration between the Israeli government and Epstein's staff over a long period of time to ensure the security of Barack at Epstein's apartment. He has a 66th Street apartment in Manhattan, kind of notorious building where some of the abuses took place and some of the victims of the sex trafficking were also kept there for periods at a time. And it seems that Barack invoked his right as a former Israeli prime minister for security to stay in that apartment, sometimes with his wife, sometimes not. And we see from these communications that there was as I mentioned, quite a prolonged degree of collaboration with people working for Epstein and the Israeli consulate / mission in New York to set up Barack in those premises. And they actually had control of entry and access to the building and so forth. Now, that does not all suggest, the very broad conclusion that they were involved in illegal activities that way. But it did suggest that they knew that Barack was very close to Epstein and they were fine with that and they helped set him up there. And were even working with Epstein himself and his associates to ensure the maintenance of this facility. That's what that story is about. It's just one, tale in a broader story of his intelligence connections we're still reporting on.
It is just one, and it goes back to Syria as well. Janine talked about implications of trying to repatriate the body of Marie Colvin and the message going through a Norwegian diplomat to Epstein. You also looked, I think, in the last few weeks through the files at Epstein's work between what appeared to be Ehud Barak, the ex-Israeli prime minister, and Russia to try to, this is a few years ago, bring about the downfall of the Assad regime. So there's work going on in Syria. Also this week, I want to ask you about another thing you've been working on. This is what seems to be deep ties between Epstein, who worked to facilitate, it seems, Israeli mining deals and security deals in Africa. Some of this up until a year before his death.
Yeah, well, recently there was a resignation of a gentleman named Sultan Soleim in the United Arab Emirates, who was the head of DP World, or Dubai Ports World. And Soleim resigned over his ties with Epstein, which were first reported on by DropSite in January. They had a very close, intimate relationship as well, too. But that relationship had a very, very important political and strategic component as well, too, which was only getting to the first steps of understanding, which is that Epstein, during his lifetime, he used to brag about his control of certain port facilities, his relationship with the head of DP World, and specifically in the context of Somaliland. It seems that Epstein, through DP World, through Soleim, they were pursuing this very broad strategy of expanding the footprint of this company through its control of ports in different parts of the world, especially in Africa, but elsewhere as well, too. And using that as a basis for first increasing and tightening the ties between Israel and the government of the UAE, but also generating a political and economic benefit personally from that as well, too. So this has been going on for quite a long time, and we see that in these emails. And our story recently was about specifically one case in Nigeria, where shortly before Epstein's death, he was helping sort of negotiate the entry of DP World in Nigeria. And again, there's a longer story there involving Barack and Epstein's activities, and another theme of selling surveillance technology to the Nigerian government. But that was all going on. And I think speaks to the broader issue, which is that Epstein was not merely a private citizen. He was a very, very important political and intelligence actor during his lifetime.
Great to have you here with us as well. The Israeli government, Benjamin Netanyahu, is saying in the past few days that he wasn't a Mossad spy, and saying perhaps it was the opposite, if anything. Let's go to Lyon next. Let's bring in Peter Conradi. Good evening, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us again tonight. Peter's the Europe editor at the Sunday Times, author of many acclaimed books, including Who Lost Russia? From the Collapse of the USSR to Putin's War on Ukraine. In 2013, you wrote The Great Survivors, How the Monarchy Made It to the 21st Century. So it's going to be fantastic to have you here tonight. You've also the author of Become the Famous King's Speech as well. Peter, you're in Lyon this week investigating and covering the death of the far-right activist Quentin Derong, who was killed last week. This is an interesting time. The US have got involved, calling it an act of, quote, terrorism. What are you finding out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary, tragic event. There was this young man who was basically attacked by a group of left-wing thugs, I suppose one should call them, and who died of his injuries a couple of years later. I mean, it was in the context of an event that was going on within the Sciences Po, the university in Lyon, being addressed by a member of the France Insoumise party on the left of the political spectrum. There were demonstrators against it outside, of whom he was one. There were demonstrators in favour of it, who were sort of taking on those demonstrators and so on. I mean, terrible sequence of events, which has, revealed, I think, the bitter rift between those on the very far left in France, on the very far right as well, and also, the political ramifications of it are very interesting. The way that it's going to be playing out in elections that are taking place across France next month to local councils, and I suppose also, obviously, in next year's presidential election.
And we'll see this weekend as well, huge rallies and protests expected to start. Very febrile atmosphere this is in. Great to have you on board. I know you'll be covering that this weekend too. Let me ask you as well, Peter, we're about to start this week's very royal crisis and go into detail. I do wonder, what was your initial reaction when you heard the news on Thursday of Andrew's dawn arrest? Were you surprised or did you see this coming?
I mean, in retrospect, I suppose it was obvious it was going to happen, but the way it was conducted, the drama, the knock on the door in the early morning, the fact that the king wasn't even told in advance. I mean, it was very much, I think, intended to say, there is one law for everyone in Britain, and that includes Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, who, despite being stripped of his titles and stripped of everything else, is still, technically speaking, 8th in line to the throne. When did something like this last happen? I suppose one would perhaps have to go back to the 1640s with the arrest of King Charles II and ultimate execution. Andrew is obviously not the monarch, but he's a member of the royal family, and this is enormous, basically.
Yeah, it is enormous, and we're hearing tonight the Liberal Democrat Party in the UK are calling for Andrew to be removed from the line of succession, that he is no longer 8th in line, and that will have to go through and be put to government and put to Parliament. It's the choice of Parliament to go through. Well, let's move from Lyon. Let's start in Norfolk. 8 a.m. Thursday morning, 6 unmarked police cars driving to the Sandringham estates, one to the front of the house at Wood Farm, the residence of Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the other 5 around the back, as is standard with a pending arrest, to make sure no one sneaks out the back. Moments later, the former prince was arrested and taken to a police station, spending his 66th birthday in custody, questioned for alleged misuse of public office. A search of 2 properties then got underway, Sandringham's Wood Farm and Royal Lodge at Windsor, where Andrew had been living up until eviction by his brother, the king. Now, 5 hours after that arrest, King Charles released a statement. He talked about saying that stating clearly, the law must take its course. He didn't mention his brother as being his brother at any stage. He talked about service and duty. Well, Andrew was released while remaining under investigation. The press managed to get an image of him inside the car as he left, one that's dominated the newspaper front pages and social media memes since. Andrew has previously denied any wrongdoing. There's been no comment on these latest allegations. Peter, you talked about it a moment ago. We have to go back 379 years in British history for the last royal arrest. Charles I, 1649. You've written extensively about how monarchs have survived into this century. With your experience, how do you see the significance of this moment?
I suppose what I have learned from writing about monarchies and their survival over the years is how difficult it can be to get rid of them, and how those that have survived all the years have done so because they've adapted, they've kind of taken what's been thrown at them, and they've somehow dealt with it and moved on. In this particular case, these are obviously very, very serious charges against Andrew. You could say, from the point of view of monarchy, on the positive side, it doesn't directly touch the king, but there are all sorts of questions, of course, about did he react as quickly as he should have done, or in fact, perhaps more importantly, did his late mother, the former Queen Elizabeth, did she not see what was going on, see that, rein in her favourite son, Andrew, much, much earlier? And I think what was telling is that if you look at opinion polls, and obviously one has to be very, very careful with polls, that even before this crisis erupted, there was already a very sharp decline in the popularity of the British royal family and of monarchy as an institution over the past 20, 30 years. There have been some ups and downs, but the overall trend was already very sharply down. And I think what we're seeing particularly in Britain, is young people are not nearly as keen or enthusiastic about the monarchy as their parents or grandparents were. So, this is obviously going to accentuate that downward trend. And I think, we can expect to see the forces, Republican forces in Britain really seizing on this and trying to get a debate going about the monarchy. And even if they don't succeed in abolishing it, which is a very, very complicated procedure, they might certainly be emboldened to find ways of cutting it down to size, to making it a little bit more like a European monarchy, for example.
Victor, listening to Peter making a point about the Queen, the Queen's legacy was unblemished at the point of her death, the late Queen Elizabeth II. There are questions. Andrew Lowney points to this in his book entitled "The Payment Settlement with Virginia Giuffre of up to 12 million." It's reported that some of that, could have been paid by the Queen. Questions about whether therefore that was by the taxpayers. Questions that haven't been answered, but those claims are still around. And I want to mention something to you. Go back to 1992. You'll remember this. The Queen described it as the annus horribilis, the divorce, separation of 3 children, the fire at Windsor Castle. Frame that with this year, Victor. This is a whole different crisis, and I want to bring the Queen back in. Do you think she will be scrutinised in a new light?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's certainly, the worst crisis for the royal family since, the abdication of Edward VIII. And clearly this is a sort of a massive blow. But one thing I think that is absolutely fascinating about the whole crisis surrounding Andrew is that actually the UK has shown that its justice system is going to hold somebody accountable who is a member of the royal family, was a prince, and King Charles has said, that's fine and that justice should take its course. And this is in stark contrast to what we see in America, where people are not being held accountable for the things they've done or for what has been found in the Epstein files. And I think that is a remarkable difference, even in France, where you're speaking from. Nicolas Sarkozy, the former president, went to jail admittedly for only 20 days, but he has been convicted on several counts, and he has served some time, and he's been under house arrest of a sort. Marine Le Pen is on trial, she's appealing the case for embezzlement of EU funds. Senior politicians, and in the UK's case, a senior member of the royal family, are being held accountable by the justice system for the things they've done. And we have to remember that it wasn't just the sexual exploitation accusations surrounding Virginia Giuffre, which, as you say, the Queen may have helped him pay for the settlement, but it's also the very important business of influence peddling, which he is perhaps certainly suspected to have done in the UAE when he was accompanying the Queen in 2010 on a visit to the Middle East, where he and afterwards he was brokering an $8 billion loan deal between the UAE and China, and essentially at that time he was a trade representative for the UK, and if he has been found to be essentially selling his influence in exchange for favors, then that is a very, very serious charge, which adds to the sexual exploitation accusations that he's facing. And Trump himself is known to have done deals with the UAE, which quite clearly benefited his family. And I think what we see is that in Europe, people are held accountable, even at the most senior levels, and in America at the moment, they're not.
Yes, it's how you're held accountable in the UK, particularly if you're a member of the royal family. Because if you look, I mentioned Andrew Lowney, he was on the programme last week, spending 4 years, asked 3,000 people to speak. Some of them said, I know your game, and didn't speak to him. 300 did. They had genuine cause for concern. And if you read it, after page after page, there are different allegations of different countries when Andrew was trade envoy. Aside from the sexual abuse allegation, and here we have 8 different investigations by different police forces in the UK. Andrew continues to deny wrongdoing. Janine, to bring you in this point, you were a reporter at People magazine. You covered the royal family in the 80s, so you've watched this unfold for a long time. What was your impression of Andrew then? And what do you make of him and what he's going through now?
It was my first job before I became a foreign correspondent, and it was basically the early 90s. It was the beginning of Princess Diana. It was Sarah Ferguson coming into the royal family, and Andrew, who was always regarded as hapless. He and his ex-wife were constantly known as taking freebies, of going on press trips, but basically free trips, palling around with millionaires, just basically unsavory, both of them. So I have to agree with Victor. I mean, I think what's the most interesting thing in all of this is the robust way that the British judicial system is handling it, in contrast to what's happening in the United States, where Trump still says, I am exonerated. So this is sad. It's sad about Andrew, but I'm exonerated, so I can speak about this. You know, what we know is that he's exonerated himself, basically, from the Epstein dossier. So basically, I mean, we've watched this decline of the royal family from the early 90s, from the Diana escapades, from Prince Charles and Camilla, and then leading into Prince Harry and Meghan Markle.
Peter, can we talk about, Janine kind of touched upon it going through as a reporter, that there are certain agreements that you have to make with the royal family. This is a wider question about transparency. David Dimbleby today, the veteran BBC broadcaster and royal commentator, saying if procedure goes as it should go, you know, this is possibly a lancing of the boil, he said, when it comes to transparency. You've spoke about this a few months ago. I think your article said, do we really want to see what is behind the curtain? A sense of, you know, Wizard of Oz mentality. The more we look, the more they might look ordinary, the more that they represent the UK in a different way. Can you explain to us that this invisible line agreement, have you witnessed it over the years? Just the idea that you are deferential, you get some coverage, but you don't ask anything challenging.
Well, I speak from the privileged position of never having actually been a royal reporter, so I've never had to make that kind of pact with the devil, as it were. But I'm very sympathetic to those of my colleagues like Janine or to others who've had to cover the British royal family, because it's terrible, because on the one level, you know, you are completely dependent on them and the people around them to provide you with information. But you also then have to write about it, and you have to risk upsetting them. So I think, you know, when I talk to people who are in that line of work, it's a constant kind of balancing act, and knowing that if you go too far, you can be effectively frozen out or cut off or whatever. I mean, the point that I was making in the piece that you quoted from, that I wrote for the Sunday Times a couple of months ago, was looking back, in fact, to the 1969, I think it was, which is when the royal family, largely at the instigation of the then Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, cooperated with a television documentary program that had extraordinary access to them, that kind of filmed them, most famously having a barbecue, filmed them sort of sitting around talking among themselves, this kind of stuff. And there were a lot of people at the time who said, whoa, you've got to be very, very careful, because we want to portray them as being human, but you also have to be very careful that you don't let too much light in on them, that you don't kind of destroy the aura of specialness or differentness that they have. And I mean, that is the fundamental issue, I think, with monarchy, that we are modern people in Britain, modern sophisticated people, yet we still allow a system where our head of state is the head of state because he or she just happens to be the son or daughter of the previous head of state. And, you know, we kind of accept that. But, you know, if you take a few steps back and think about it, it is a pretty weird system, really.
Victor, a pretty weird system, and one which takes us back to that, you know, the lifting of the curtain. How much do we want to see? But the questions of how much should be answers, whether it's genuine questions. The BBC, for example, Victor, this week, they interviewed Prince William for a panel show on Radio 1 about mental health before the arrest of Andrew. But clearly, in the midst of the royal scandal around him, he wasn't asked a single question about his uncle or the family. We don't seem to afford any other public figure in public life that grace and favour. The BBC's been criticised by several commentators. Its response was it was a panel discussion, not an interview.
Yeah, I think it is pretty tough. You know, you think back to those interviews with Diana in the past. it is a special institution in the sense that they are not elected officials, and that in a way means they are playing already by different rules, as Peter was just saying. You know, they are there by virtue of birth, which is already, I think, as you said, pretty bizarre. So if you elect a prime minister or a minister or an official or an MP, I think you sort of have the right to challenge them. But if they're just sort of imposed on you by, you know, hundreds of years of tradition, then it's a very different story. But yes, clearly there's always that problem of, you know, the combination of wanting access, but also wanting to tell the truth. And after all, the British royal family is not the only situation where that kind of thing happens. I mean, you look at business reporting is sometimes very tricky for exactly the same reasons. You know, you want access to the CEO, but the people around him and he himself are absolutely determined that you shouldn't actually reveal anything interesting in the interview, because that's almost certainly going to be negative. So you have that tension all the time, but it's just much more extreme, I think, in the case of the British royal family.
It is a public role in a public space, but not a public office, at least up until the point that Andrew, in this case, was trade envoy. In British law, you are innocent until proven guilty, which takes us to the US, back to Epstein. The Trump administration, when they were asked in the middle of last year about releasing the Epstein files, the conclusion from the FBI was no evidence within the millions of files to prompt any additional investigations into any third parties. As of today, with half the files released and another 3 million pages still redacted, at least 10 countries have launched investigations into third-party individuals. Norway's opened a formal corruption investigation into the former Prime Minister, Torbjørn Jagland. This week, the French prosecutors set up a special team to review the files and open 2 formal investigations into sex offences and trafficking, as well as financial offences, including money laundering. Turkey, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland also launching criminal investigation teams reviewing the files. And on Thursday, Bill Gates pulled out of the India AI summit hours before his scheduled keynote address. He faces questions of judgment in his dealings with Epstein. He's not accused of any illegality. His reasons for withdrawing, he says, was to ensure the focus of the summit remained on AI. And to Thursday, a figure central to the rise in Epstein, Les Wexner, the founder of Victoria's Secret, gave a 5-hour testimony to one of the main investigative committees in Congress, calling Epstein a conman, saying he'd given him control of his personal finances as a practical decision based on trust. It was not an endorsement of criminality, he said, claimed he'd ended the relationship when he found out about child sex abuse. But it wasn't his words that made headlines. It was this from his lawyer.
But then all the things were inventoried. That wasn't work for me or Jeffrey. It was just regularly done. Answer another question. 5 words, okay?
Quote, I will bleeping kill you if you answer another question with more than 5 words, okay. Janine, what do you make of the efforts of the information gathering in Congress? We've had Wexner now, Ghislaine Maxwell. Well, she didn't give any information. She took the fifth. Epstein's former accountant, his former personal lawyer, Richard Kahn and Darren Indite will appear, and Bill, as you mentioned, and Hillary Clinton due to appear.
Yeah, I mean, it goes further. It goes to academia. It's Larry Summers of Harvard, who was, of course, in Obama's cabinet. It goes to the president of Bard College, an elite liberal arts college, Leon Borstein, the Clintons, but it's even people like Noam Chomsky. It's a hero of the left. So I think in terms of the investigation, it's lagging, and we know why it's been lagging because of Pam Biondi and basically all of the obstructions that have been put in the path. I think for the victims and the survivors, it's an important moment because I think we will see what Britain is doing, taking the lead in this extremely robust, this attempt starting with Andrew and moving down into all the other countries, France, Norway. For me, the most surprising thing is the United Nations and the diplomats that I knew and worked with throughout various wars, Syria, Palestine, Terje Rod-Larsen, but also Egeland and others. The UA diplomat who said to Larsen, if you think I'm pretty, you've got to see my sister. She's even younger than me. So it's going deeper and deeper, and just really shocking that that Epstein permeated this level in the United Nations, diplomacy, that he was on this grand scale.
And the size of it, there are different scales of those by association with no illegality and no questions, particularly on Bill and Hillary Clinton. You talk about the former Norwegian diplomat who denies
Terje
Rod Larsen, who denies misconduct. And at the same time, Victor, just listening to Janine, we have a situation where I want to pick up on Bill Clinton, for example. He flew on Epstein's private jet in a 2000, what he says was philanthropic work, according to the Epstein documents. So there are questions around what he could have heard, seen, been aware of. Both he and Hillary, as I mentioned, are not accused of illegal activity. Hillary has stated this week there is nothing to hide. And I guess one thing that's very unusual, all of this information has come out while these investigations are ongoing. We're all getting to read what appears to be, testimony for or against people.
By the way, she was at Munich. She was at the Munich Security Conference, and I believe that she should not have gone. It was the moment when the photographs came out. There's some really damning ones of Bill, and I feel that she should not have gone to Munich. She should have had some basic decency and stayed home. So it is interesting how people are distancing themselves, but some of them are involved. She was married to Bill Clinton. She might say, I knew nothing about it, but I don't believe that she, shared, whether or not she shared his bed, but she shared his life. She was first lady and his partner later on. So I think that she should, in some ways, step down from her public activities. And appearing at Munich last week, where basically the conversation was about Epstein, but it was about Ukraine and Gaza and other things that are urgent.
Well, she says she's never met Epstein. She had met Ghislaine Maxwell a number of times. She's not been charged or accused of any.
Her husband.
But he hasn't been charged with at this stage with any illegality.
Not yet.
They've both said they've got nothing to hide. Victor, just picking up on Janine's point about a lot of questions for a lot of people. What struck you when you're looking at these files? Are there particular areas? I should mention one, actually, areas that are still redacted. There's one name who's redacted, who he says this, quote, "Your littlest girl was a little naughty last night," and no sense of why the name of the sender is redacted. The victims group says it's not a victim.
Yeah, there was a complete screw up, wasn't there, when they released the a part of the files, and they redacted some of the names of the perpetrators, but didn't redact the names or even the photographs, I think, in some cases, of the victims. But I want to take you back to something that Janine was just saying about Pam Biondi and the Justice Department. I mean, again, we have this problem that in the US, people have not been held accountable. As Janine, I think, was saying, Trump has kind of exonerated himself, but actually there's no evidence that he's been exonerated by what's still in the files that we haven't seen, even the redacted files. And then you just have to remember that this week a massive poster of Trump was put on the corner of the Justice Department in the US, and you just think that when you see it, I'm sure you've seen the pictures. It looks like something out of the old Soviet Union or Mao's China or North Korea today. It's quite extraordinary. And it simply shows that the Justice Department is no longer, able to act as a neutral body doing the work that it should be doing and holding people accountable for this Epstein scandal, but also for everything else.
You've all written extensively about Ukraine. I want to look at Ukraine. It's this week. We are 4 days away from what will be 4 years since Russian forces attempted to capture Kyiv, eliminate the government. The plan back then, we know now, is to control the country within 2 to 3 days. Now, we lost Mataza. He's having problems with his line tonight. But I would like to give the three of you who've spent extensive time writing and living the story in Ukraine as well, a minute each as we wrap up the programme on where you see the stalemate in talks and where this is going. Starting with you, Peter.
I think a number of issues have obviously been resolved in the talks, but the most difficult issue remains, and that is one about territory. Vladimir Putin has got a large chunk of the Donbass. He wants the entire Donbass. Can Volodymyr Zelensky actually give him more territory than he has at the moment? I don't think he has. That's going to remain the stumbling block, and I just don't see how a peace deal will be done by May, by June, or in a sense ever, if there isn't found a way of resolving that fundamental issue.
Victor.
I think in a way that the fundamental problem, and this applies to the negotiations as well, is that Trump is clearly very lukewarm towards Ukraine, sometimes hostile, and quite warm towards Russia. And this applies to the rest of the far right, or much of the rest of the far right across the world. I think today it was that Hungary blocked an EU loan for Ukraine that it needs to keep itself financially above water, that was supposed to come in April. So until that issue of Trump's unwillingness to really dedicate US resources in a much more substantial way to help Ukraine, I think we're going to sort of carry on with the same kind of stalemate, with the Europeans doing what they can to fill the gaps, and the Ukrainians doing an extraordinary job of maintaining more or less the status quo for the last year, and that's where we are at the moment, in a kind of deadlock.
Janine, Russia's accused of pretending to negotiate. They've sent in this week Vladimir Bendinsky to talk, a Kremlin advisor known for his past, known for performing as a fancy dress battlefield reenactor, who analysts say is not authorised to make compromises. What's your take?
No, but I just want to put one thing in there about the peace deal. I direct a war crimes unit in Ukraine. We work directly with the prosecutor general in Kyiv. Our research helped land Putin's indictment about the abducted Ukrainian children. There can be no peace deal without accountability. And that is what every Ukrainian believes. It's about Zaporizhzhia, it's about Donbass, it's about Crimea, but more importantly, it is about justice for Ukraine. And if you give Putin what he wants, which is basically impunity and immunity from what he has done, the hundreds of thousands of criminal incidents that we look at every day, then you will have war again. And you will also send a message to every bad guy around the world, whether it's Netanyahu, Trump, Orban, whoever, that you can get away with what you have done. So for us, it's about getting the tomahawks. That is what Ukrainians want more than anything. They need ammo, they need tomahawks, but they need justice. And you can't have a peace deal unless you have accountability.
You've ended it neatly and poignantly, as always. Janine, thank you. Excellent expert panel this week for your insight, experience that are absolutely essential now more than ever. With me in the studio, thank you, Janine Giovanni, renowned war correspondent, author of 9 books, founder of the Reckoning Project. Thank you to Peter Conradi, Europe editor of the Sunday Times, author of many books, including Who Lost Russia? From the Collapse of the USSR to Putin's War on Ukraine, The King's Speech, and particularly pertinent this week, The Great Survivors, How the Monarchy Made It to the 21st Century. Thank you, Peter. And to London as well. Thank you, Victor Mallet, senior editor at the FT and author of many books, his latest being the newly released Far-Right France Le Pen, Bordella and the Future of Europe, and a brilliant cover, as we saw. Thank you as well to Murtaza Hussain in DC, Foreign Affairs correspondent at Dropside, on his link between Israel and Epstein. Thank you, Murtaza. Thank you for watching. Before we go this week, a quick nod to the longest-serving civil servant still in office in Downing Street, the Chief Mouser, Larry the Cat, clocking up 15 years this week. Adopted as a stray from the Battersea Dogs and Cats home, he has seen 5 prime ministers come and go, nearly a 6th this last week. He has no limit on questions for reporters allowed to ask, although good luck to you is whether or not he will answer you. He's not in the Epstein files and have it on authority he cannot buy his favour through kibbles or catnip. We will leave you with Larry, courtesy of the Daily Mail and the Downing Street photographer, Justin Nang. We will see you in 7 days for the world next week.
So, he's more of a lover than a fighter. He loves to pose. So that means if there's a red carpet there, he's just ready to just show up and then show his face, maybe do an over the shoulder like a movie star would do on a red carpet.